All right, guys, we've got a great story to read today. It's nothing like yesterday's story. In fact, this one is a true story. We don't have any exaggerations, but it's still a very exciting story. It's called A Curtain of Spun Silver. So I want you guys to think about that title and think about that as you're reading. What is a curtain of spun silver? All right, so this takes place in the 1600s. So historically, think about when the Pilgrims first came over to North America and started colonies. That would be the 1600s. So you kind of get a time frame. So think of like pilgrims, right? Okay, now think about why the pilgrims came to America. It's because they were being persecuted for their religion, right? They wanted to worship God in their own way instead of the way that the country of England, the King of England, was telling them how to worship. And we are going to read a true story about a man named Henry Havers, and he was a pastor in the town of Stambourne, England in the 1600s. Okay, now as you're reading, there's a few vocabulary words that I want you to be aware of. Okay, so it'll make your reading easier. And of course, you can always use context clues. I know that you can do that, but I'm just going to go ahead and give you these ahead of time so that when you see them, you instantly know. Okay, so a kiln is like an oven or a furnace. In the 1600s, that would have looked like a fireplace. Nowadays, if you've ever gone to like Ceramic Cafe, you know how they fire after you've painted and it makes that shiny shellac. They're putting it in a kiln, a very high furnace. Now, in the olden days, and in particular in our story, the kiln was in a mill where they would take wheat from the fields, they would grind it up, and they would put it in the kiln to kind of keep the moisture out of it, okay? Here's a word, persecution. We've read about this a lot in Acts. We could see that a lot of the disciples were being persecuted. Remember, Paul started off as a person who was persecuting, and then he became a person that was persecuted, right? He was being treated badly because of his beliefs, because of his faith, right? Okay, so, and then the last word, congregation, means a group of people gathered together. Usually we use this in the context of a church congregation, people that are gathered together to worship, all right? So that's what a congregation is. So kiln, persecution, congregation. I want you to pay attention to those words when you see them. Okay, so I'm just going to get you started on reading this story. You're going to finish, and remember, you're thinking about what is the curtain of spun silver and what does that have to do with this story, all right? So I'm going to get you started off, and then there's a Google Doc for you to finish after you're done reading. Okay, so let's start on page 134. Mr. Havers bowed to pray in the rustic chapel. The men, women, and children knelt on the rough wooden floor and joined him. They prayed for Archbishop Sheldon, who persecuted the little church and had tried to imprison Mr. Havers. You know how the Bible tells us to pray for our enemies? That's what this congregation is doing. Mr. Havers is the pastor. They're all kneeling down on the floor, and they're praying for Archbishop Sheldon. He is the guy who is persecuting them for their beliefs. So they prayed, and they prayed for the families of the 10 men who had been arrested and might be put to death. So there have been 10 men who have been arrested for their faith, and they might be killed. So these people are praying, and that's exactly what the Bible tells us to do, right? Okay, let's continue. Finally, they thanked God for his loving protection and care and for the salvation he gave in Christ Jesus. Mr. Havers hummed the closing hymn thoughtfully as the congregation rose to leave. 2 strong men slowly opened the door of the church. They crossed the creek just below the church and searched for the soldiers who might be hiding nearby. At last they motioned for the others to come. Silently, the congregation hurried to their cottages in the nearby villages. Boys and girls, we have such a wonderful freedom that we can attend church, whether it's online while we're in quarantine or when the quarantine is gone. We can go to church freely. We don't have to watch out for soldiers watching for us, but in places where there's persecution, that's what's happening even today. even back then in the 1600s where we're reading today. So the congregation has to open the doors quietly, look around to see if there are any soldiers, and then sneak quietly back home. That would be scary, wouldn't it? Okay, let's read the last bit. At home, Mr. Havers opened his Bible and started to study. Someone knocked loudly at the door. Mr. Havers rose and opened the peephole. A young boy stood gasping for breath, his cheeks bright red and his eyes full of fear. "What's the matter?" Mr. Havers asked, lifting the latch. "The men who work for Archbishop Sheldon just rode through the village looking for you." The boy held his side. "You must run, Mr. Havers. They are bad men, and they will not let you live to have a fair trial." So this boy has heard some news, and he's letting Mr. Havers know. He's run all the way because it's a very important news. This is an emergency. Mr. Havers glanced toward the village and saw a cloud of dust. "See, they're on horseback and they'll be here any minute," the boy said. "Oh, please leave, Mr. Havers." The boy turned and raced to the gate. "Trust God," Mr. Havers called in his strong, deep voice. "He will protect us both." Okay, I'm going to stop there, and I want you to see how God protects Mr. Havers. Okay, so please finish the rest of the story. It ends on page 138.